Hello, everyone. This is Laura Kopek. I'm your host of Health Matters with Laura Kopek. I am a functional nutritionist, traditional naturopath, health educator, and the purpose of this podcast is to take on issues that relate to our health that often in the public can be very confusing and misleading. So today we're going to dive into the subject of food because I get these types of questions asked a lot in session or when I do public speaking and have a Q&A. And I thought it was time to kind of do a podcast and clear the air on some of this. Okay, before we get started, a quick disclaimer. All the information in my podcast are for educational purposes only and are not a substitute for medical advice. Okay, let's take on one of the big ones, gluten. I get this question asked a lot, and it's typically phrased this way: Are you going to tell me I have to stop gluten, or does everybody have to stop eating gluten, or is or how bad is gluten really? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about with food today is how food sits on a spectrum. Pretty much all food sits on a spectrum. So let's talk about gluten, because I think if we have an understanding about the way gluten itself fits on a spectrum, then maybe some of you can make different choices, better choices when you're trying to navigate this. So what I mean when I say all food sits on a spectrum, we're talking about quality essentially. So when you make homemade banana bread from an ancient grain like spelt, that's a very different food product than going to McDonald's and having a hamburger on the bun that they provide. So there's a huge difference there. And let's kind of take that apart. What sits on the lowest end of the spectrum when we talk about a flour product is all the chemical additives that cause that flour product to be preserved for an extended period of time. So things like dough conditioners, artificial preservatives, even a high fructose corn syrup is going to be something that allows it to be shelf stable for an extended period of time. So like when we talk about bread, true bakery fresh bread has about a 24-hour lifespan. So if you shop at a bakery, day-old bread is usually half price and starts to disintegrate from there. Old-fashioned recipes included things like soaking it in egg and milk, like French toast or bread pudding. These were all things that came out of stale making, not food not going to waste and making use of the stale bread. But in order to extend the lifespan so that we can buy products whenever we want, things like preservatives were added into these things. The problem with that is that when a food contains something to extend its shelf life, it also means that it's not going to decompose and be broken down in your digestive system as rapid and effective as we want. Hence, why things like low carb diets are essentially that much more effective, because what you're doing is taking a product that has been designed to not be broken down, metabolized as efficiently, and now you're trying to consume it. So again, when we talk about something like bread, what is meant to sit on the shelf for a really long time and still stay soft and fresh is not the same as something that, is made in a bakery or made really fresh. To the contrary, when we talk about something like an ancient grain, then we're talking about something that hasn't really been altered through a farming practice. And so those ancient grains are more, they're just more easily digested. They just haven't been altered through any kind of evolution process, whether it be in the way that different species are created in farming or even actually genetically altering something. So The other thing to think about is actually when grains are made into a flour, they do have a shelf life. They can go rancid. So, this is also something that we may not know the behind the scenes of what is going on in food when we buy it at a grocery store. Something that's pre-made, again, a cake or a cookie, and it's in the bakery section, so it's seemingly fresh, but we don't really know how fresh it really, really is. So, because things like sugar give a preservative like feel to things and will extend the life of it. So, again, if we look at the kind of the whole scope of that, you're going to get this freshness and homemadeness sitting at the top end of the spectrum in terms of quality, and things that are really poorly made, the more they have artificial ingredients in it, the more that's stacked against your digestive system. Okay, sourdough is gaining even more recognition. Let's talk about what that is and how that can move a gluten product onto the upper end of the spectrum. True sourdough is a cultured and fermented yeast. It's often fresh. So, again, we're talking about the freshness of something. And so that freshness can sometimes turn a bread product that has a true sourdough starter, into something like a yogurt where a lot of it is kind of pre-digested. So in a true sourdough, in a really fresh bread, then that's going to have some of that gluten pre-digested. It's why people that might be gluten sensitive, or even maybe think that they have a version of celiac, actually can tolerate sourdough, because it's a pre-digested, and if that sourdough is made from scratch, you're again removing even things like histamine buildup that might interfere in the way that that food is broken down. So here's where we get into a little bit of confusion about, gluten-free products. Sometimes those gluten-free products are actually going to be on the inflammatory side. They're going to sit on the low end of the spectrum in terms of quality, because the only thing that's really removed is the gluten part of that processed food. So sometimes people really need to look at what's going to be in the best interest of their health. Do they need to remove processed food altogether for a while? Because sometimes if your diet is filled with a lot of processed food, and that person has become gluten intolerant, or even having celiac diagnosis or symptoms, and then they just jump into a different version of processed food, they're actually they're taking one step towards better health by moving the most inflammatory protein in processed food, but they're not taking a huge leap in their health if they don't look at food as it sits on a spectrum, and if the majority of their diet is still that heavily processed food, but just gluten-free. So what I tell people is that you need to kind of consider, do you need to be free of processed foods in addition to free of gluten? And then do we look at like whole grains like rice to kind of fill in that transition, especially kids that are growing and they may not be able to be completely free of kind of those filler and starchy products, but they really need to come away from a lot of those bottom of the spectrum foods that contribute to different kinds of inflammation.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Okay. Another popular question that I get about food related to, food on the spectrum is, dairy. And it often gets worded like this: is dairy okay? Or is dairy bad for me? And so it's kind of a really loaded question. So first of all, when we talk about dairy, most people are talking about cow's milk and the different products that it's made into. And so we have to think about, well, cow's milk, first of all, is breast milk from a cow that's meant to grow a large animal, even larger. And that animal puts that milk through a twice digestive process. So right out of the gate, it's hard to digest. But again, it's all going to sit on a spectrum in terms of quality. So if we want to be able to include some dairy in moderation, and we want it to be a less inflammatory version, then we need to look at what sits on the bottom of the spectrum and how do we move up what sits at the top. Okay, so definitely when we look at unburdening inflammatory food, we want to remove things like, again, those inflammatory ingredients, even things like pesticides and herbicides. So organic dairy is going to sit a little bit higher than conventional dairy. So that's the first thing that moves it up. Second thing is when we take products like yogurt, if it's already got added sugar, or even in some of those kids yogurts, it might have food coloring in it. That's really putting that dairy product at the bottom of the spectrum in terms of how much inflammation and what kind of ease is that product going to have to be broken down. Lactose can be a problem for some people. That's the sugar molecule in dairy, and some people just don't have that enzyme. Different age groups have more accessibility to that lactase enzyme. So like when kids are growing from the age of 4 until they start puberty, they may have more enzymes to break that kind of food down. And then after puberty, that starts to reduce, which is why when this enzyme reduces, it can be one of the reasons why teenagers can have acne that's related to the consumption of dairy. Dairy is also a hormone disruptor. So for some teens, when their acne is kind of peaking, it may be because they're eating too many hormone disrupting foods, which are dairy, gluten, and sugar. So yeah. Cheeses. Let's talk about cheeses. I think this is a big thing that people are just like, I don't want to give up cheeses. Well, again, all cheeses are not made equal. And the softer cheeses, the lighter colored cheeses, those are often easier to digest, easier to break down. Things like mozzarella, they have a low acidity. They're often put through a water bath. That's going to be a much easier cheese to digest than, say, like a really hard cheddar, which is going to be more inflammatory. So when you're trying to pick out cheeses to make the digestive process a little bit easier, kind of leaning towards those softer. Again, things like yogurt, the protein is pre-digested as long as the yogurt doesn't have added sweeteners to it, added coloring. You can be in control of that. Doesn't mean you can't sweeten your yogurt, but buying it plain and then using your own sweetener to be in control of it is going to be moving that product again up the spectrum in terms of quality. Which leads me to talk about sugar. Definitely, this is a very confusing food, if you will. It's not really even a food, but let's dive in and let's talk about this. So I'll get lab work back, and often in functional lab, there'll be an indicator that somebody is really having a problem with sugars per se, and the response is, oh, I don't eat a lot of sugar. Because I think in general, when we think about sugar, we think about things like soda or candy. But sugar is in more things than we think. It has more names. And even something like processed food, things that are like white flour, very starchy, they're going to convert to a glucose very quickly. They're going to become sugar very quickly. And if the activity level doesn't burn off all of that sugar, that carbohydrate, that's when that sugar converts to a visceral fat, which is why a lot of people find that, again, reducing their carbohydrates can help um, burn some of that stored fat because their food that they eat doesn't exceed their ability to burn those calories. When we talk about sugar itself, like cane sugar, which is made into a white sugar or a brown sugar, most of it that is produced is genetically modified. So if you want to avoid the genetically modified version, then you're going to want to purchase organic, and that will help improve the quality, again, the removing some of the inflammatory factors to an already inflammatory food. And certain types of, sub-quality versions of sugar, sweeteners, those are going to be even more inflammatory. They're going to sit kind of at the bottom of that spectrum. So things like high fructose corn syrup, very inflammatory. The body doesn't even really understand completely how to process it as a sugar. So even if the activity level justifies the higher carbohydrate count, you're going to find that that's still inflammatory. It's very inflammatory to the liver. It has been linked to things like fatty liver, and it's really antagonistic to the brain. So it can be a real kind of behavior disruptor. Certainly, corn syrup is a less inflammatory version of the high fructose corn syrup. And your chemical sweeteners like aspartame, those also can be really hard on the brain. Those no calorie sweeteners, while they might not spike glucose, still have a version of inflammation that can be very detrimental. So things of that nature fall really low on the spectrum. Of course, then you get into more natural sugars like coconut sugar, monk fruit sugar. And these are falling a little bit on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of having less inflammation associated with it. But the other challenge with sugar is that we don't really understand how to read a label when it comes to added sugars. And so I think it's really important that we understand that about 4.5, so 4 to 5 grams equals 1 full teaspoon. So, like when you're buying those instant packets of oatmeal and it's got 10 to 12 grams of sugar in it, that's, 3 full teaspoons. And would you ever, in a plain oatmeal, add that much sugar directly to your serving? So, if you buy unsweetened and you add sugar but add less of it, then you're also going to be moving that overall experience up on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of quality and, again, reducing inflammation. Sugar really disrupts mental health. It's not just, that some things like high fructose corn syrup are a behavior disruptor. Overall, it can interfere in neurotransmitters, which can contribute to imbalances that often will lead to diagnosis like anxiety, depression, things of that nature. It can be a contributing factor. And a lot of us, the general public isn't really as aware as how much our mental health and behavior is associated with the foods we eat. And again, if you're not severely allergic and you want to make changes but not cut these foods out, moving the quality, moving those foods up the spectrum a little bit at a time as you're making these transitions in order for them to be sustainable is going to be a much better. I always say doing something is better than doing nothing. So it's making better choices that will help you get out of inflammation. Another misconception I hear in general is people are like, I don't want to eat healthy because I can't afford organic. Or somebody will say, but I don't understand why I feel this way. I eat everything organic. So I think both of those have some, they're just not a really grounded way to think about health and nutrition. So the first thing is, if you eat all organic, that doesn't mean that you're making good choices, right? Ice cream can come in as organic, chips, candy. Like you can eat an entirely poor and inflammatory and unhealthy diet, and it can be all organic, and you will have spent that price point on it and think that you're doing best. But our body really thrives and lives off of nutrients and colors from real foods that have DNA and RNA built into the cellular makeup. So if you're going to compare an organic cookie to a conventional apple, the better choice is still the regular apple. So when I say conventional, that means that it's has pesticides. The farming practices include pesticides and herbicides, so it's called conventional. But that apple is still a better choice over the cookie, the candy. I have seen a lot of people that just feel like they should be healthier because they eat all organic, but they're not making good choices when it comes to some fundamental rules about food and how that sits, again, on the spectrum in terms of our total health and wellness. So, organic has its time and place. Everything does not necessarily have to be organic if that's something that's not going to fit in your budget. Looking at something like Environmental Working Group, they do the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. They update that regularly, so you get to look at, well, what is going to have the most trace of pesticides in it so that I can avoid those. And then, what will have the least amount so that I don't have to concern myself with those being organic if it doesn't fit into my budget. So, again, the takeaway from that is uh, organic has its place. To eat all organic doesn't necessarily mean that you're eating healthy. It's just a movement in quality, but you still have to make sure that you're eating fundamentally good foods, vegetables being the primary thing to really focus on, to make sure that, you're getting the nutrients that you need. And probably, I think one of the other misconceptions I hear question, the way that things are phrased is, well, I don't want to give that up. So why does it have to be all or nothing? I mean, you don't necessarily have to give something up unless it's doing some serious, serious harm. But most of the time, it is the amount that is the problem. People lose sight of moderation, and that becomes the biggest problem. And, we understand it in terms of things like alcohol, right? I think most adults understand that if you drink too much, there are consequences in the moment. But sometimes people are drinking on a daily basis an amount they consider to be acceptable, but on an ongoing basis. And alcohol is very inflammatory on a continual basis if you don't give your body a chance to just kind of really push it all completely out before you consume it again. It is a hormone disruptor. So as men and women age, it can have an even harder hit on the body because of its impact hormonally. But it is the frequency of certain things. Look how often you are eating gluten. Is it at every meal? That's a lot for anybody. Is sugar at every meal? Is a dessert every day? Some of these things our body just really can't handle if it's a constant, constant, constant. And look at where you might create meals or days without these things. And that includes something like alcohol. I mean, we learned that we need to be responsible when it comes to things like alcohol, but we lose the ability to think about eating and drinking responsibly, not just with alcohol. So maybe it's about just a different mindset, not just the quality, but quantity, and where that puts food and drink on that spectrum. If we talk about alcohol specifically, definitely you get into, again, a spectrum. So when you get a mixed drink that has a lot of, like you take like a mixer to a margarita. If that mixer is made with high fructose corn syrup and some food dye, that is going to be hugely inflammatory. The amount of sugars, the kind of sugars, the addition of artificial ingredients, and then combined with alcohol. Beer and wine sit kind of further down the spectrum. If we take some of those mixed drinks with artificial ingredients at the very bottom, and then we move up, beer is going to be the next level of inflammation. When you look at beer and wine and why that might be more inflammatory is because you get into that yeast and sugar and alcohol combination. Beer has gluten in it, so that's why that's further down the spectrum than a wine. But this is why people find that over time they don't feel like they tolerate these things because they're incredibly inflammatory and really hormonally disruptive. But getting into a harder liquor, vodka, gin, these things sometimes are made off of juniper. Gin is sometimes made off juniper or cucumber, and vodka is sometimes made off potatoes. So kind of knowing where the alcohol originates from. Of course, the harder liquors have a much higher alcohol content. So then when you think about the higher alcohol content, you want to think about, again, the moderation. And of course, again, any of these things that I'm talking about, when they sit on a spectrum, this excludes anybody that has a medical condition where they should not drink or eat any of the foods that I've talked about. None of this excuses those medical conditions. Okay, one last thing about wine. The thing that I found really interesting that I've learned is that the higher the alcohol content, the more it will burn off the sugars. Sometimes that can make it a less problematic experience in terms of digestion and inflammation for somebody as they're going through things like menopause. So that can be a really interesting discovery. Okay, well, that was today's episode, a different kind of look at food and drink, specifically things like gluten, dairy, sugar, alcohol, and how we rank and think about food, and organics as well. We talked about that today. So remember that today's episode is for informational and educational purposes. If you want to deep dive into your own food and drink issues, please set up an appointment, a consultation with me so we can do that in a really customized manner. But this is also meant to just think about food differently the next time you plan your day or even think about a meal.